A river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first branch is Pishon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are also there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. The Bible sounds positively nonchalant. If you can pinpoint the 4 rivers, you can locate paradise. In fact, many Eden seekers claimed that the unusually matter-of-fact description was the reason they decided to look for Eden in the beginning. It just sounded like a real place. Upon closer inspection, however, problems arose. Everyone knows that the Tigris and the Euphrates run from Turkey through Iraq, ending in the Persian Gulf. But no one knows for sure where the rivers Pishon and Gihon are or were. The details don't necessarily help make sense of things. Yes, Pishon circles a land called Havilah, where gold and a number of other valuable things can be found, but nobody knows where Havilah is either. The Gihon circles a land called Cush, but nobody agrees on which ancient land used to be called Cush. Thus, to solve the Eden equation, you'd have to solve the Pishon-Gihon unknowns. To do that, you'd also have to solve for Havilah and Cush. The biblical algebra reached a level of detail that boggled my mind, which lacked training in Greek, Hebrew, or ancient geography. So I decided to back up to find out where the search itself had begun. Who had first decided that Eden could be found? Not surprisingly, it's a very old story with innumerable branches. Among those people who believed that Eden could be located using Genesis as a map, there seemed to be 2 main camps, roughly aligned with the 2 pairs of rivers. Tigris-Euphrates seekers took it for granted that the Tigris and Euphrates named in the Bible were the Tigris and Euphrates that we know now, and so the Pishon and Gihon would have to be somewhere nearby. That puts Eden in Iraq, or possibly Turkey or Armenia. Seekers more interested in the Pishon and the Gihon than the Tigris and Euphrates tended to have more fanciful geography. Since we no longer knew where the Pishon and Gihon were, perhaps they were not near today's Tigris and Euphrates. Since the Bible mentions 2 rivers that are no longer known by those names, these seekers believed that we couldn't trust the names at all. Perhaps today's Tigris and Euphrates are simply named after Eden's original Tigris and Euphrates, much as Lebanon, New Hampshire, was named after Lebanon, Lebanon. For them, Eden could be anywhere. Most of the Eden seekers, whether they followed fanciful or realistic maps, did not see themselves as opposed to science. In fact, new scientific discoveries and techniques seemed only to spur their old search forward. By the early 19th century, fossil discoveries began to indicate a much older Earth than the biblical chronology could account for. Naturalists such as Lamarck and Darwin proved that species changed over time, meaning that God did not create, say, the birds of the air all in one fell swoop. At every point in the process of the separation of science from religion, however, new ideas were slow to take hold. In 1840, the famous Harvard naturalist Louis Agassiz published his theory that the Earth had undergone a relatively recent and entirely transformational ice age. This theory was controversial. Many people assumed that the last great upheaval to form the Earth's surface had been Noah's flood. Agassiz's ideas would revolutionize modern geology. Darwin took some of his writings as endorsements of evolutionary theory, but Agassiz himself was still a believer in what might now be called intelligent design. He referred to a species as a thought of God. He believed that glaciers had been created instantaneously and were of divine origin. He called them God's great plow. Agassiz was possibly the last venerable scientist of his generation to keep his reputation while disavowing evolution. After the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859, most scientific thinkers began to shift away from belief in a world that had been created, poof, all at once in a particular spot on the map, with a man, a woman, an apple, and a snake. People did like to refer to the Galapagos Islands as Darwin's Eden, because Darwin's idea of natural selection originated there, but that's really a joke. Picturing the man who brought us natural selection standing in the garden, is like imagining a meteorologist who believes thunderbolts come from the hand of Zeus. Darwin himself did not want to commit to any geographical point of origin for Homo sapiens, let alone pinpoint sin or paradise on a map. In his 1871 Descent of Man, he did allow that humans probably developed somewhere geographically near where our primate relatives still live. Quote, "It is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. But," Darwin declared, "there was also a large ape that roamed Europe not so long ago, and anyway, the Earth is old enough for primate species to have migrated all the way around it by now. So," quote, "it is useless to speculate on this subject." Darwin was diplomatic in his dismissal of the quest for Eden. The same could not be said of the 19th century radical Victoria Woodhull, who advocated for women's suffrage, labor reform, and free love, and in 1872 was the first female US presidential candidate. In her epic speech of 1875, The Garden of Eden, she saw no reason to tolerate such nonsense. Any schoolboy of 12 years of age who should read the description of this garden and not discover that it has no geographical significance whatsoever ought to be reprimanded for his stupidity. But there were holdouts. Men much older than 12, and they were mostly men, were still speculating on Eden, uselessly or not. Darwin, Woodhull, and the pace of the modern world did not stop the missionary explorer David Livingstone from declaring in 1871 that Eden existed at the source of the Nile, which he judged to be in a region of Zambia. Nor did modern science dissuade distinguished British General Charles Gordon from insisting in 1886 that the island of Praslin in the Seychelles off the east coast of Africa conformed exactly to the geography of Genesis. Even Victoria Woodhull was an Eden seeker of sorts. She did spend 2 hours and 16,000 words on the topic. She set out to prove that Eden wasn't a place on the map, but she did arrive at another figurative destination for Eden. In Genesis, declared Woodhull, Moses had written an allegory of the human body before it was defiled by sin. The 4 rivers all branch out from the stomach. What accounts for the amazing persistence of this quest? If the search for Eden is a centuries-long epic novel, the post-Darwin chapter is a major plot twist. For the first time, anyone seeking Eden did so in full knowledge that this garden did not mean the same thing to everybody. Was it the origin of species or paradise lost? No longer could seekers count on their audience's familiarity with people like Augustine, Josephus, or John Calvin. Seekers might claim demurely that they just happened to read the names of those 4 rivers in Genesis and much to their own surprise came up with the location of Eden. But really, nobody stumbled upon the Pishon and the Gihon. Those who looked for Eden always had an urgent reason for doing so, even if they kept it to themselves. They would have to answer at least 2 questions. Not only where was Eden, but more important, what was Eden? And answer they would. Eden is part paradise, but only part. Really, the story is much bigger. Eden is supposed to tell us where we came from, what we've done wrong, and where we go from here. No wonder we keep looking. Ideas of Eden still flow on, long past Darwin, into the late 20th century and beyond. I set out to follow Eden as far as it would take me. The terrain I covered along the way, bizarre, heartfelt, desperate, had yet to be explored. So now I want to do something a little bit different and, as I said, read the first sentence of several chapters in sequence. I decided to start every chapter in the same way, which you'll hear, and then to write that first sentence sort of in the voice of the character that chapter covers. So you'll see they take a whole bunch of different styles, and I hope I can turn pages quickly enough. In the beginning, millions of years ago, the Lord God planted a garden northward In Eden, there was an abundance of sunlight, sequoias, and electricity, and all the biological conditions were most favorable. In the beginning, when the heavens had not been named, and likewise the firm ground below, the primordial waters of Tiamat mingled as a single body. So begins the Enuma Elish, the creation myth of the